Good morning. I'm grateful to Rona and the team for inviting me to share some of the findings from my MA research. I'm sorry not to be with you today. I hope that what I offer is of use in your discussions. Let me tell you why I chose Episcopal power as my research topic. Firstly, I'm one of the team of transition coaches working with new deans and diocesan bishops in the Church of England. I find this work a huge privilege, accompanying people in their first months of a senior role. Explicitly and implicitly, much of the conversation seems to me to be about power. Secondly, my work as a mediator takes me into church conflicts. My experience leads me to reflect that so much church conflict seems to be about power. I try to notice the power dynamics. I'm also aware of my own power as an external mediator, not least because I've often been asked to intervene by a bishop. I've done a lot of thinking about power in those contexts. Thirdly, for 7 years, I worked for a bishop, resourcing him in his role in the House of Lords. It was only a few days a month, but it gave me a perspective on the way that he was aware of and used power, which he did thoughtfully and effectively. This role also gave me the opportunity to reflect on the use of power by others in the House of Lords. So I found myself intrigued by power and bishops, which led to my MA research, in which I asked, how do bishops in the Church of England understand power, and what implications does this understanding have for the way they undertake their role and work? So this morning, I shall talk briefly about how I approached my research. I will outline some key findings from my research, firstly some key themes, and then some theories of power. In sharing my research, I've realised that it can be tempting to only have a focus on the bishops and power, and rather than also thinking about power personally. So at different points during the presentation, I will offer some questions as an invitation for personal reflection in response to what I've shared. And then at the end of my presentation, I will offer some wonderings about power emerging from my research, which I hope might have possible connections with the theme of today's event, bullying. Both personal reflective questions and the wonderings will be available afterwards, and I think also in chat, so you don't need to scribble them down. So let me briefly tell you about my methodology before outlining the findings of my research. I analysed theories of power, for example, Foucault, Lukes, Haywood, Nye, Haugard. What is power? How is it understood? I analysed theologies of power. An important theological text is the Ordinal, which is both explicit and implicit about power, its source and purpose. Then, in conversation with my supervisor, I decided to focus the other theological analysis on what was being written by people in the Church of England now. I looked at Sykes, Avis, Slee, Higton, Storkey, and I also referenced Reddy for a Black theology perspective, although he's not in the Church of England. My research included interviews with 11 diocesan bishops to earth the theory and theology in lived experience. This is about 25% of the diocesans. I interviewed men and women, bishops with different lengths of time in the role, in predominantly urban, in predominantly rural dioceses, bishops from different church traditions. It's worth just noting that apart from the then Archbishop of York, there were no diocesan bishops of colour at the time of my research. So let me outline for you some of the key findings of my research. How do we view power? You might want to pause for a moment and reflect on how you view power. What words come to mind for you? Do they indicate that power is something bad or something good? As power over others, or perhaps as power exercised in constructive and positive ways? Why might you have these views of power? My research demonstrated that generally power is regarded as a bad thing, as power over, domination, manipulation, control. This is evident in the theoretical literature. It's Foucault's starting point as an example. This is evident in the theological literature, such as Avis's book on becoming a bishop. This was also evident in the interviews with bishops. It's interesting to me that much of what is written and spoken about power is about power as domination, as control, as manipulation. Might this make it hard, perhaps especially in the church, to acknowledge power and to talk about it? I'm intrigued that power used well tends to go unnoticed and unremarked. Perhaps it's easier to notice power when it's used badly or in a way that does harm. I wonder if this focus might perhaps reinforce a view that power is generally a bad thing. I find it helpful to recognise that power can work in a number of different ways. My research demonstrated that in organisations, two important types of power are cultural power and structural power. So cultural power is the explicit and implicit norms and values that determine what is acceptable and unacceptable in the use of power within a particular organisation. Structural power is the way that power is distributed and allocated through organisational structures in roles and processes. And cultural and structural power are often communicated via symbols. So, for example, the Church of England's ordinal talks about sharing power, explicit cultural power. The synodical process for decision-making is a structural way in which this cultural power sharing is embodied locally, regionally, and nationally. In the General Synod, members of each of the three houses sit together on the floor of the Synod, perhaps particularly true when they meet in London. No one role or group are raised up as higher than another. This symbolically communicates the explicit culture of sharing power and reinforces the relevant structures and processes. My research demonstrates a difference between explicit and implicit cultural power in the Church of England. In spite of explicit principles about sharing power, the bishops interviewed experienced the General Synod, for example, as a place of limited power, which seems to create a general competitive approach to decision-making. Furthermore, bishops also perceived this finite, limited power in the wider national church institutions, which they reflected led generally to a competitive, zero-sum approach to power. In the General Synod and other national church institutions, bishops talked about it as a competitive approach that seemed often to be about winning or losing. It seems that in terms of cultural power in the Church of England, explicitly there is enough power to be shared, whilst implicitly there does not seem to be enough, resulting in a competitive approach. Interestingly, the theoretical literature suggests that when people perceive there's not enough power, they tend not to work collaboratively, preferring to hoard or compete for power. This seems to be borne out in the bishops' experiences within the national church institutions. By contrast, however, bishops rarely experience power as something to compete for in their dioceses. Their approach was generally to share power with others, which is resonant with the explicit culture. Indeed, many spoke of giving it away. Organisational culture permeates throughout an organisation. Therefore, I wonder if the contrast demonstrated in my research between explicit sharing of power and implicit competition runs through the Church of England. For example, do those around the bishops in their dioceses experience enough power to share, or do they experience a competitive approach to power? Since my research, I've tested this question about culture informally with some suffragan and area bishops, with some deans and clergy. Although this isn't formally part of my research, it's interesting to note that at least anecdotally, these roles tend to experience power in the diocese as limited, as something over which to compete, echoing the bishop's experiences within the national church. It seems that the implicit culture of limited power for which there is competition, rather than the explicit culture of enough power to give away and share, might be part of the culture of the Church of England. Here's a couple of reflective questions for you, perhaps to come back to later. How often in your role do you feel the need to compete for power rather than feeling there is enough power to share with others? What might the sharing of power look and feel like in the face of misuse or abuse of power as part of addressing bullying behaviour? Nye talked about hard and soft power. Hard power is assigned and distributed through structures and roles. Soft power is the sources of power that come through relationships, such as influence. Authority was identified as the main form of hard power that comes with the bishop's role. Bishops saw their authority as limited, though mostly they didn't want any more. Some wondered if others perceived bishops as having more authority than they do, projecting expectations of power onto them, for example, to remove a vicar. Some bishops wondered if they would welcome more authority, specifically to deal with challenging or complex situations in parishes. But most expressed discomfort about the amount of authority they had, preferring to rely on their softer power of influence in those situations. Rather wonderfully, one bishop spoke about signing things, of giving permission, of giving blessing, as a form of authority that they were delighted to have and exercise. Another form of hard power is expertise. In the ordinal, bishops are to exercise their expert power as theologian and teacher. In terms of cultural power, therefore, expertise is explicitly valued in the Church of England. There are other forms of expertise. It was interesting to note how significant legal expertise became as a source of power in the early weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic. Whilst bishops were generally expressing discomfort about having authority, they were more comfortable with their relational or soft power. Sources of power such as influence, empathy, personal approach and style. For some of the bishops interviewed, relational power was consistent with images in the ordinal of bishops as shepherd and particularly as servant. Some bishops reflected that their authority was limited, which meant that they usually relied on their relational power to bring about change. Some of the bishops talked about giving away power, framed as servant leadership, an act of giving up power modelled by Jesus in the washing of the disciples' feet. More of that later. Nye also talked about smart power, the intentional choice of combining hard and soft power for a specific situation. However, this is not easy. Two bishops talked about trying to encourage open and honest conversations with those around them. In each case, this proved to be more challenging than they had expected. There was a reticence to speak openly or to express disagreement. I just wonder if the bishop's authority undermined their relational power. In the end, however relational they were in their use of power, they were still the bishop, with authority over future opportunities and appointments, which might have hindered open and honest conversation. Here's a couple more reflective questions for you. What authority power do you have? What expert power, particularly perhaps in the role that's brought you here today? What types of relational power do you recognise you have? And would you welcome more or less of each of these types of power? And why? And how do you experience the interplay between authority and relational power in the exercise of power by others and in the exercise of your own power in different contexts? Let me turn now to theologies of power. The bishops articulated a number of different theologies of power, its source and purpose. If there was a dominant theological framing, and this wasn't strongly, it was that of servant leadership. There were two passages referenced in particular, Philippians 2, in which Jesus empties himself, known as kenosis, and Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It's just worth noting that the meaning of kenosis, of Jesus emptying himself, is contested. There are a number of different ways of understanding it. In my research, it became clear that kenosis was understood by some of the bishops and argued by some of the theological texts to mean that Jesus gave up power as part of emptying himself. The conclusion, therefore, being that as a bishop, they too must give up the power they have. This tended to be reinforced by an interpretation of Jesus washing his disciples' feet as a model of giving up power by becoming a servant. Sykes traces this theological interpretation to Luther's not power but service, which has developed to an accepted framing of service that gives up power. Avis's book on becoming a bishop is an example of this. However, Sykes suggests that service is not a substitute for power, but rather an expression of it. Therefore, the intention and motive for service is important, because service is an exercise of power. A Church of England Faith and Order Commission, FAOC, report published in 2003 argues that as image bearers of God, to be human is to have and exercise power. By sharing in the divine nature, all humanity potentially shares in that power. Rather than seeing power as a bad thing, the report suggests that fault lies in the heart of those who love their own power without regard for the justice of God, who is the author of that power. The FAOC report challenges the modern celebration of powerlessness, suggesting that the incarnation was a redefinition of power as meekness, humility, and vulnerability. The report argues that power is a gift of the Holy Spirit for the building up and empowering of the church, and therefore not an alternative to service, but an expression of service. And furthermore, that power is essential for the liberation of the marginalized, a key role for the church. As I drew my research to conclusion, I found, and indeed I still find myself, wondering what the church would look like if we took seriously this theology of power. If I were to use my power in a way that recognizes and makes space for you to use your power as co-image bearers of God. If we understood service not as a giving up of power, but rather as an intentional exercise of power. If each one of us used our power not for our own self-interest or to satisfy our own needs, but rather attentive to others and to build up the church. Here's a couple more reflective questions for you. What's your theology of power, its source and purpose? And how does that theological framing resource and equip you for the power you have and the ways you exercise it? And to what extent does your theology of power resource you for the work you do regarding bullying and the misuse or even abuse of power? So as I draw my presentation to a close, I hope that these findings of my research will provide you useful food for thought for your discussions this afternoon. There are, of course, other themes and conclusions from my research, but that's probably for another day. I'd like to leave you with some wonderings prompted by my research, and I hope relevant to addressing bullying behaviour. These will be available afterwards as well, and I'm just going to screen share as we go along here. Some wonderings. I wonder how we might create constructive and honest ways to talk about power, including power used badly or abusively, but also power used positively, constructively, and well. I wonder how we might discern and shape a thoughtful, life-giving theology of power. What difference might this make to our attitudes and exercise of power? I wonder the extent to which the experiences of abuse of power in the past and present in the Church of England reinforce negative views of power, and therefore power is something bad. I wonder how we might be open to the possibilities of positive and constructive uses of power without negating that history. I wonder why power used badly, negatively or destructively seems easier to notice than power used well, constructively and positively. I wonder how the church might change if we celebrated power used well. And I wonder what a constructive and positive cultural power would look and feel like in the Church of England, one in which there was more than enough power to share. Thank you for your attention and interest this morning. I hope that I've offered something that will be useful in your thinking and your discussions this afternoon. As I said at the start, I'm sorry not to be with you to participate in and listen to your discussions. I hope today is fruitful, enjoyable, stimulating, and energizing as you go about this very important work. Thank you.